previous video left off as we were discussing a quick schematic linear gesture drawing to establish composition. So just in the very same way that we would begin a still life or really any other drawing, we would do some light gesture line and vine charcoal just to get the figure or the object on the paper. And so that's what we're seeing here. And then we'll just kind of briefly go over the steps on how to construct a figure drawing. So you would be looking at a model at this point. And when we have a model in the classroom, we often do quick sketches of like 5 or 10 minute long poses. And we try to get as much information on the paper in those 5 or 10 minutes before the model moves again. And a lot of times we'll start by, just in the same way we block in for the still life, we start in the same way, just like blocking in the large form. So in this case, the artist has chosen geometric, literally blocks. So there's a system, as you can see, diagrammed on the left-hand side, and then the system is utilized to create these 3 drawings of the figure. So it's a rectangular vertical block for the head, and then you'll see this larger rectangle, almost like a shoebox, for the chest, and then a vertical rectangle, a more horizontal rectangle for the hips. And when you look a little bit more closely, you'll see that you could divide each body part into an elongated or shortened rectangle. So it's sort of a formal reductive process, and here is what that might look like. So some are a little bit more rhombus or trapezoidal, but interesting for me to see an artist choose blocks as opposed to, say, ovals or more rounded forms, which we'll see in a second. But you get a sense of 3-dimensionality, especially if you just came from drawing linear perspective, for instance, where everything started out in a block. So sequentially, it sort of makes sense to take this approach. Also, it's somewhat cubist, right? So here is a drawing now in the Uffizi, and there is no date on it. So we're not quite sure when this drawing took place, but we probably would consider it rather old. And so here is a very similar, like an active scene, a study for an active scene, using a kind of a reductive formal analysis of the individual forms into their rectangular components. Now, this is how I would approach a figure with a more spherical construction, because for me, despite the rigid bone structure of humans, I tend to think of us as sort of soft, rounded, squishy things. So this is the similar analysis of a female figure using a spherical construction as opposed to the block construction. And then here is a Raphael study for Virgin and Child from the early Renaissance, pen and ink. And you'll really see repeated rounded forms again and again in this drawing. So this is a study. So Raphael here would be drawing the same model over and over again, just trying to figure out exactly how he wants to make this painting. And so this week's study are for a longer drawing, and we will be doing that very same thing. So in terms of proportion, here are some interesting examples of how artists deal with proportion. So as I said before, despite our vast diversity in human appearance, outward appearance, human bone structure is very consistent throughout all ethnicities and ages. Adult human bone structure. The child is a little bit different. So even when we are drawing an individual with unique characteristics, we almost always start from the same framework. So in classical figures are about 7 heads tall. So we see this line drawing in the centermost one on the pinkish paper. Our figure is thought to be 7 heads tall. So if we were to establish a standing straight on figure, as we're seeing here, in order for it to look most realistic, we would make the figure 7 heads tall. So we take the head and make sure that's repeated 7 times in the standing figure. Now, if it's seated or lying down or there's foreshortening going on, of course, the proportions are still the same, but we're not going to see them that way. A little bit to the right, we see this sort of godlike idealized figure, and the godlike idealized figure is 8 heads tall. And then we see this like cartoonish superhero kind of figure from contemporary video gaming, for instance, and that is even more monumental at 9 heads tall. So very powerful body. And then, of course, you see some smaller cartoon, and then an early Albrecht Dürer etching on second from the left. So proportion matters, obviously. And in order to figure out the proportion, we usually go back to the skeletal structure of the human, which, as I said, remarkably similar throughout, human history and ethnicity. And here are some studies. Just trying to figure out, incidentally, the human hand is often a lot larger than we think it is. I just backed up to the previous slide. It's a lot larger than we think it is. It's about the size of the front of the head. And then also the arms are longer, I think, generally than we think they are. So if you look here at the skeleton, you'll see the hands hang really to fingertips to mid-thigh, if not a little bit below. And the hands are larger, I think, than we generally think they are. And here's a good example of large hands. We will do some studies of our own hand in making some sort of gestural movement. And it's a really complicated form to draw, but it's great practice, especially if you want to break it down into the spherical or rectangular components of your fingers and palm. And of course, on top of the bone structure are muscles. And when you study human anatomy and how people are put together, you study the skeleton and then the muscular skeletal system. And that brings us to drawing the standing female nude or the standing male nude. In this case, this is a male nude. And you can really see the muscular structure underneath the skin in this drawing. In terms of fat distribution, a little bit different from gender to gender, and that's described here. I don't know how useful this image will be to you. But when we see how flesh sags due to gravity, it kind of matters a little bit where the fat deposits are. So, and we see in the human figure that there's a little bit more flesh and fat on the torso, the abdomen, the thighs, the breasts, and then apply gravity to that, and you get this very realistic looking, like weighty, monumental, very human looking, flesh-like a figure in just charcoal and paper. So for me, it's pretty impressive, pretty astounding. Shift in body symmetry we discussed very briefly a few minutes ago. When the weight is moved from one foot to the other instead of being evenly distributed, then the hips are going to shift in one direction. Often then the chest and upper torso will shift, the head and neck shift. So these are all things to take into consideration when trying to figure out what you're drawing, trying to create a composition. We call this offset figure, this S-curve figure, a contrapposto. It's an Italian word that describes this exact stance, and it's very beautiful. Of course, artists like Pontormo might exaggerate for a certain effect, for a certain dramatic effect. So there's this like a more of an exaggerated contrapposto, maybe not a super comfortable pose to hold for any long period of time. And the gesture drawing in the classroom. So this is the kind of thing you would do with a model that was changing positions every 5 minutes. You just get those quick sketches, quick lines down on paper, and then she would move again and you would do it again. So this is a really beautiful drawing for me. I love the line quality the artist used. You could tell the same artist drew all 6 of these in the same period of time. And that is where we will end our discussion on full figure drawing. Thank you.